Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Today is the 27th of August 2021, 3 p.m. Moscow time. I would like to declare the first technical break. One of the members of the council, Marina Kravtsova, is currently in the traffic jam, which is to arrive within a couple of minutes. So we started our meeting on time, but we declared a 5 or 10 minute break so that we enable a quorum for the meeting. Thank you. Then the first technical break is open. I will declare when it finishes. Dear colleagues, we declare the first technical break over. We would like to continue our meeting. Today, we are considering, the Dissertation Council is considering the defense of the dissertation Dai Chuang for the degree of candidate of Culturology in the scientific major 24001 Theory and History of Culture. The topic of the thesis is the transformation of the status of contemporary art in Russia and China, comparative analysis. By order of the Academic Secretary of Universitetskaya University, Alexander Vladimirovich, dated May 13, 2021, number 4815/1, I, Evgeny Anatolyevich Makovetsky, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Department of Culturology, Philosophy and Cultural Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University, was appointed Chairman of the Council. The same order approved the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce them. Alexey Vaproxin Anatoly Mikhailovich, Doctor of Culturology, Associate Professor of the Department of Culturology, Philosophy and Cultural Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University. Smirnov Alexey, Doctor of Philosophy, Associate Professor, Department of Culturology, Philosophy and Culture and Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University. Demshina Anna Yurivna, Doctor of Culturology, Associate Professor of the Department of Art Criticism of St. Petersburg State Institute of Culture. Kravtsova Marina Evgenyevna, Doctor of Philology. In the remote access mode, the meeting is attended by Pidyukova Marina Varenkyevna, Doctor of Culturology, Associate Professor of the Department of Museum Affairs and Protection of Monuments in Petersburg State University. Marina Valerievna, can you see and hear as well? Yes, thank you, everything is fine. Alayev Gennady Evgenyevich, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Philosophy and Pedagogy of the National Technical University, Dnipro Polytechnic. Can you see and hear us? Yes, everything is fine. Plashenkova Zlatitsa, PhD, Professor of the Department of Philosophy and History of Philosophy, Comenius University in Bratislava, Slovakia. Can you see and hear us? Yes, can see and hear you well. The applicant is also present with us, Chuan Dai. She can see and hear as well. Also, the supervisor of the applicant, Evgeny Georgiev Sokolov, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor, acting head of the Department of Russian Philosophy and Culture at St. Petersburg State University, is also present at the meeting. In order to improve the quality of communication, I would like to ask you, dear colleagues, who are in the remote access mode, to turn off your microphones and to turn them on when you are given the floor. But please do not switch off your mobile phones in case we have any technical problems, so that we could contact you as swift as possible. I'd also like to inform you that audio-video recording of our meeting is being conducted, live broadcast on the website. Simultaneous interpretation is being carried out. On the screen of the live broadcast of the meeting of the Dissertation Council, you can see the email to which you can send questions to the applicant or express opinions concerning the content of the thesis or the presentation. And the questions will be transferred to me. The question should be directly related to the applicant's presentation and the content of the dissertation. It's obligatory to indicate the name, position, and place of work of the author of the question. Questions are not related to scientific discussion, to the thesis itself, and anonymous questions will not be voiced. In accordance with the procedure of awarding the academic degrees of Candidates of Sciences, the academic degrees of Doctor of Science at St. Petersburg State University, approved by local regulations of St. Petersburg State University, you are now to called the order. In accordance with the order, the Dissertation Council should consist of no more than 2/3 of the approved members of the council. Our council consists of 8 people and all 8 present, including 3 members of the council in the remote interactive mode, with audiovisual contact provided. Thus there is a quorum, 100% quorum. And I would like the officer to take the minutes of the proceeding. I establish the following rules of procedure. And the approximate duration of the meeting is 2 hours. First, brief information of the chairman about the applicant and the documents submitted by the applicant. 2, short presentation of the applicant. 3, questions to the applicant according to the report. 4, answers of the applicant. 5, speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with the assessment of the thesis. 6, speech by the answers of the applicant. And Chuan, if you do not object, you can provide the answers to all the questions. Next, after the answers, open discussion will be taking place. All those present might express their idea and ask questions. But I would like everyone to be brief and only on the topic of the research. It is necessary before you speak to indicate your name in the minutes of the meeting, and you should introduce yourself, stating your position and place of work, which is required for the minutes. 9. I will voice the questions, which will be received via email, and the applicant will be able to answer the questions. Then the floor will be given to the scientific supervisor of the applicant. Then we'll proceed with the discussion by the members of the Dissertation Council before the open roll call. Then we start the open roll call, counting the votes, making decision awarding, not awarding academic degree, and the concluding remarks of Chuan Dai. That's the final 15th point. So this is the order of the procedure. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to these regulations? If there are none, we will move to the first point in the rules of the procedure. I have a technical request. All those present should turn off the sound of their mobile phones, and those in remote access mode, please don't turn off your mobile phones so that we could phone you in case of need. So I'm starting to conduct the meeting. So the first, Chairman's brief report. Dai Chuang, thesis for the degree of candidate of Culturology in the scientific major 2401, Theory and History of Culture, on the topic Transformation of the Status in Contemporary Art in Russia and China, Comparative Analysis, was accepted for defense by the Order of Scientific Secretary of State University, dated March 05, 2021, number 1519/1. Dai Chuang wrote the thesis research on the basis of Petersburg State University. Scientific supervisor is Doctor of Philosophy, Professor, acting head of the Department of Russian Philosophy and Culture, St. Petersburg State University, Sokolov Evgeny Georgievich. The number of publication of the applicant, in which the main scientific results of the thesis are set out, according to the presented list, are 8. In peer-reviewed scientific publications from the list approved by the Minister of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, 4 publications. There are no publications indicated in the scientific databases, Web of Sciences, and Scopus. The applicant submitted to the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University a complete package of documents for acceptance for consideration and defense of the thesis. All documents correspond to Clause 12 of Section 3 of the procedure. All the documents submitted by the applicant, according to the information that I received from the curator, meet the requirements and are stored in the applicant's attestation file. Their copies are also in the possession of the employee of the Department of Support Dissertation Council, who is now attending the meeting. Before giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Dissertation Council. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any questions to the applicant? Well, any general questions to the applicant? There are no questions. Thank you. Then I give the floor to Chuan Dai for a brief presentation. Chuan, the floor is yours. Dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, your attention is invited to the thesis for the degree of candidate of Culturology on topic Transformation of the Status of Contemporary Art in Russia and China, Comparative Analysis. The relevance of the topic of the thesis is based on the special status of intercultural communication between Russia and China, two leading world powers, and at the same time radically difficult cultural formations with their own traditions, sometimes non-transitive systems of meanings, and the internal logic of building symbolic layers of culture. Revealing differences and similarities through comparative analysis of the two cultures also allows us to get out of the usual horizon of the cultural reflection and notice some essential characteristics of modern Russian and Chinese culture. Cultural transformations currently taking place in Russia and China are largely stimulated by radical changes in the field of art. Contemporary art, both in Russia and China, represents a new form of cultural creation. It reflects new artistic consciousness and is aimed at reflecting and comprehending the realities of the globalizing world. The aim of the research was to clarify and compare the main stages of the transformation process of the status of contemporary art in Russia and China. The implementation of the goal involved the solution of the following tasks. Consider the phenomenon of contemporary art in Russia and China in context of the influence of the current cultural and philosophical reflection in Europe. Analyze the influence of cultural tradition on contemporary art in Russia and China. To determine the criteria for a possible comparative analysis of contemporary art in Russia and China. Identify the main stages of transformation of contemporary art in Russia and China. Compare the most important works of contemporary art in Russia and China. To present and systematize the results of comparative analysis of comparative art in Russia and China and draw general conclusions. Thesis is based on the analysis of the sources of artistic works of contemporary Russian and Chinese artists, such as Samov, Larionov, Malevich, Tatlin, Xubeihan, Xibashi, Lin Fengmeng, Zheng Deqian, etc. Also, architectural monuments of the Russian avant-garde were used. As a theoretical basis for the study, we used the following ideas of such philosophers as Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Bergson, Gassier, Roland Barthes, Derrida, Heidegger, Deleuze, Greuze, Lortman, Van Guowei, and Zhong Baihua. The research consists of an introduction, 3 chapters, conclusion, and a list of references. The first chapter, entitled Contemporary Art and the Culture of Russia and China, the Condition and Ability of Comparison. We consider the basis of comparative analysis of contemporary art in Russia and China. The criteria of modern arts are analyzed, how they were formulated in the European culture. The impact on the transformation of the status of comparative art in Russia and China is analyzed. The various reflections of contemporary art in the culture of Russia and China considered. The second chapter, entitled Contemporary Art in the Culture of Russia, analyzes the features and substantive aspects of the process of transformation of status of contemporary art in Russia. Essential characteristics of contemporary art are being considered. those developed in the context of Russian culture. The third chapter, entitled Contemporary Art and the Culture of China, studies the aesthetic theories of two contemporary Chinese philosophers, such as Wen Guwei and Deng Binhua, and the features and transformation of modern Chinese art and their influence of the transformation process typical for the genre and Chinese art drawing, both contemporary and of 80s in China. The research results are the following. We were able to identify the main stages of transformation of contemporary art into Russia and China. The most important works of contemporary art in Russia and China were studied in comparison with each other. The results of comparative analysis of contemporary art in Russia and China was systematized and presented as general conclusions. The scientific novelty of the research lies in the fact that comparative analysis of contemporary art in Russia and China was carried out by indicating its special status in these cultures. The influence of American-European centric concept is shown on the modern self-reflection and development of culture in Russia and China. Also, the differences in the symbolic meanings of work of art in Russia and China in the context of cultural issues were investigated. The main provisions of defense. First, the distinction between contemporary art and the concept of contemporary art, important both for Russia and China, since both Russia and China sees the development of contemporary art through the assimilation of European aesthetic and other theories, while maintaining the lasting connection with tradition. 2. The criteria for the modernity of Russian art were developed in the area of the Silver Age and determined its development up to the present time. The first stage is the transformation of Russian art expressed in the trend toward decorativeness of modern art, and the second in the trend towards the shaping of the art of avant-garde. 3. Criteria of the modernity of Chinese art were also development at the beginning of the 20th century, but the process of radical transformation of art in China begins starting from 1980s. 4. The understanding of art as the creation of forms characteristic of European and Russian art is absent in China due to the fact that Chinese culture develops outside the influence of the European metaphysical tradition. 5. Chinese ink drawing reproduces the paradigmatics of the meaning of each stage of culture and preserves the continuity of the changes. The vitality of the genre confirms its existence, and this, in return, the relevance of artistic things in the structures of the artistic consciousness of many generation carriers of Chinese culture. 6. The transformation of the status of contemporary art in China is due to the influence of European art and philosophical and cultural thought. As a result of this process, the modernization of the Chinese cultural tradition is taking place. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Chuan. Now the members of the council might voice their questions based on the report. Yes, Anatoly Mikhailovich, the floor is yours. I had the pleasure to get acquainted to your research work, and I think the most important thing is the new point of view on the issue of non-transitiveness of culture. And it shows the authenticity, but nevertheless it is an obstacle to our cultural dialogue. What do you understand what do you mean when you say comparative modern art, contemporary art? And why do you use Russian avant-garde and modern on the one side, and the Chinese art starting from the 80s on the other side? Why do you use these two objects for comparative analysis? So what do you mean when you talk about contemporary art? If we talk about modernity and contemporary art, I paid attention to the first chapter, and I talked about the history of art and European art, because the modern art was based on Europe. I described the art in France, which is very obvious. Then I paid attention to the culturological aspects. And design example coincides with the concept of modernity, linked to the change of the view of the artists. And the third aspect is the philosophical aspect. Many philosophers talked about metaphysical tradition. How postmodernist philosophy emerged. What is the source? And answering your question, why in Russia we take avant-garde and modern Russian art. If we talk about these stage of the art, if we talk about the manual art of modern age, we can see its decorativeness. This decorativeness was not characteristic of traditional art, and this decorativeness plays a very important role, which is not linked to the cultural tradition. And secondly, in the history of Russian avant-garde, which can be exhibited in architecture, for example, we can see the culture of modernity. The form, the formation are the main topics. In China, there exists European and modern art. It does exist. We can see it for performance, for example. Performance, which is very popular in European and US, we can see Dai Chuang as one of the representatives of the modernity. Thank you for the question. If there are any more questions, you can ask them now. Thank you very much. Chuan, you can be seated for a while. Thank you for your report and for the answer. And now we move to the next stage. We didn't get any external reviews, so there is nothing for me to read. So we would like to move to presenting reviews. The reviews were published on the website of the university for preliminary reading, and thus I would recommend the participants to voice only the main ideas and not to voice the entire reviews. And then we start with the reviews. I will give the floor in accordance to the minutes of the proceeding. And the floor is given to Anatoly Mikhailovich Alexeyev-Apraxin. Yes, dear colleagues, in my idea, Dai Chuang is dedicated to a topical issue on Based on the works of transformation stages of the plastic arts in Russia and China, the author identified stages, tropisms, and roots of the moderation of cultures. The comparative analysis used by the author and culturological approach revealed the potential of mutual understanding of peoples and raises the question of preserving cultural traditions. But the novelty of the research lies in the study of status of transformation in contemporary art, studying the forms of influence of Western globalization project on self-reflection of cultural figures from Russia and China, identifying the forms of synthesis found by domestic and Chinese intellectuals. The practical significance of the thesis is grounded in the development of intercultural contracts, museum and exhibition practice, the need of updating educational programs for the study of Chinese and Russian cultures. The value of the work submitted for examination complies with the requirements. The practical significance can be reflected in the published materials. The requirements to the publication of the scientific results were met, and I believe that the work is author's perception of the scientific research. I had one more question to the applicant, but this is a rather thought-provoking question about the modernizing influence of West on China and the East as such. Can we consider the Chinese realistic artworks of 70s and 60s as an influence on the global Soviet project on Chinese art, which had a modernizing effect on art? And if it is not applicable, then why? We have agreed that Chuan will provide the answers to all the questions after voicing all the reviews. In the very beginning, we have agreed that Chuan will provide answers to all the questions presented. And now I give the floor to Zlatica. I would like to say, first of all, that I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to read this research paper, because I found it highly interesting. And I wanted to see how the applicant managed to conduct this comparative analysis, since the analysis is very important in the modern epoch of globalization. The applicant outlined general common features of these two different cultures and spheres of art. And also the applicant was able to show the differences. I agree with the method used, the comparative method applied. But I would also like to pay attention to the intercultural approach. I'm not going to mention all the aspects of the research paper that I have paid attention to, but on the whole, I would like to say that the research is conducted on a very good level, that the conclusions formulated are well grounded. But nevertheless, there are a couple of comments. We have already heard that the applicant interprets Chinese postmodernism, which is linked to the 80s. But in my opinion, this work could focus more on the comparison of Chinese postmodern art and European postmodern art. My second comment is related to the comparison of Chinese and Russian art. I believe that the applicant paid more attention to the garden art. My question is why this type of art was used as an example. And the third comment is the comment that has already been voiced. Why paying specific attention only to the avant-garde of the 20s? Maybe the evolutionary art of 60s, 70s and 80s would be interesting to include in the research paper. But I would like to say that these comments are minor and they do not have a negative influence on the general positive perception of the work. And I agree that we should award the scientific degree of the candidate of Culturology. Thank you very much. Gennady Evgeniyevich Alayev, are you here with us? Could you please voice your review? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My greetings to us colleagues from St. Petersburg, from Ukraine, from Poltava. And this city is well known in St. Petersburg throughout the last 320 years at least. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be a member of the Council. I would like to say that I praise the dissertation, the thesis of Dai Chuang. We can say that the relevance is obvious, taking into account the cultural and political processes. The method, which is the comparative approach, is a very interesting method and contemporary method. And the applicant did a great job. I would like to say that there was a great amount of information and data. Zlotitsa mentioned the garden art, and I would also like to say that certain specific works were chosen. And in this respect, we might ask, why wasn't this done, why wasn't that done? But this is quite obvious for such a work. As for my remark, I would like to pay attention to such an aspect as the external chronological discrepancy. When we talk about the Russian modern art of the beginning of the 20th century and we compare it to the Chinese postmodern art of the second part of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. My first remark is dedicated to the following issue. The determination of the criteria of the modern art in the context of philosophical reflection is not enough based on philosophical concepts. I mean postmodernist approach. And later on, Dai Chuang will consider the idea of modern and postmodern art. When the applicant talks about modern art and outlines certain characteristics, Dai Chuang talks about modern art. Well, in Russia, in English, this is related to contemporary art. And we expect, taking into account our experience of the last decade, if we talk about the modern art, we expect to get cutting-edge examples of modern art. Was this conscious approach that modern and postmodern art were put together and were viewed as one unit? Or are there any other causes for it? This is a very noticeable feature. Thus, certain issues, certain questions arise. Because when we talk about modern art within the context of Russian modern of the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, it is not what modern art is now, for example. If we take into account all the contemporary interest in the epoch and the philosophical aspects of the epoch, this is well understood. One more remark that I'd like to make is the following. My third remark: the modern information revolution gives significant changes in understanding and forms of the modern art. Computer graphics, animation, special effects, web design, computer games, and cutting-edge technology mean the start of the new age, not only of technological but of cultural transformations, determining the change of the status of modern art. Unfortunately, these processes were not dwelt upon. Again, I would like to say that it was impossible to include all the aspects into the research paper. And I hope that in the future Dai Chuang will take into account this aspect as well. But on the whole, I'd like to say that I have a very positive impression of the work. This is good work which deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of sciences, Culturology. Marina Valerievna Birikova, if you're ready, the floor is yours. I would like to say that the dissertation of Dai Chuang was dedicated to the differences in the art of China and Russia, taking into account the cultural differences. Taking into account the differences in traditions. The main feature of the hypothesis of the thesis is the analysis of so-called zones of non-transitivity. These are blocks of culture, including archetypal cultural consciousness of the two countries, and there need to be a special approach to demonstrate these processes. According to the author, it's necessary to develop a theoretical toolkit for carrying out painstaking and adequate comparative analysis of different cultures, allowing to say the aesthetic context of each culture, and on the other hand, to discover something in common that provides intercultural communication. The applicant revealed the features of the influence of American Eurocentric concept, modernity of theory of art, and the development of culture in Russia and China, identify differences in symbolisms and semantic features of work of art in context of intercultural issues, contemporary art in China. Thus, the research is aimed at identifying certain features of transformation linked to metamorphosis of art in the categories of European types of modernism and postmodernism. And my first remark is the description of the concept of modernity. Sometimes it's too lengthy. Too many authors were cited or mentioned, from the key authors to extremely modern ones. Later on, the analysis is not limited to globalist projects, but it focuses on Russian exhibition practice as well as relevant Chinese practice. It should be noted that the author testifies to the worthy participation of disclosure of the decision hypothesis. The author analyzes the character of exponential trends in the Russian and Chinese arts as a result of the development of those metamorphoses that the art and culture of the two countries went through. I'm not going to describe the chapters. The author shows the approach to the analysis of the cultural situation in the countries within the context of the existing cultural and philosophical realia. analyzing the cultural and philosophical background for the emergence of these types. I would also like to pay attention to the list of references, which is not entirely correct. But since this is a multidisciplinary and disciplinary work, this is a minor negative aspect. Thank you for your attention. Marina Valerievna, thank you very much. We would like to proceed. And I would like to give the floor to Demchina Anna Yurovna. I'd like to greet all my colleagues and everybody present and the applicant herself. I would like to say that the thesis had a very positive impact on me, and this thesis is relevant for a number of reasons. First, the Chinese cultural artistic culture is one of the spheres of the production of something new which influences European and American culture, both elitistic and massed culture. And the images of technology and ideas are being used, and the interweaving of the tradition into modernity. The second reason is that the author addresses not only the concept of modern art, but the concept of modernity as a culturological, philosophical category with which the author is working within the framework of the dissertation. And I consider this aspect very important. Next, within the framework of the research paper, the author solves three issues. Identify the concept of modernity based on Russian art, American art, and Chinese art. Each page discloses much work and data collected on the topic. The research paper has a scientific novelty since the author determined the culturological content of the concept modernity of the art development. A profound comparative analysis was being carried out. And we looked at the development of art in Western countries and America, as well as China, based on the modern art. The conclusions could be also seen in published materials. Nevertheless, I would like to pay attention to a number of questions that I counted when getting to know the work. The first question has already been voiced. I understand why the author took non-linear ages. I understand why avant-garde and modern art in China were used, since these are revolutionary aspects. Since in Russia we had a revolutionary movement which has a very strong influence on the war. And for China the situation is pretty much the same, but it never states it explicitly. I as a person who is a culturology and who is ready to move into a different direction, to a different country, I would like to say that sometimes the approach was rather superficial. The work conducted was conducted at a very positive level, but we don't see the dynamics. How did it change during the time of modernity, post-modernity, and how does it change now? So this concept looks like a huge iceberg, actually, which might undermine certain results. Well, definitely the above-stated remarks do not impede awarding of the scientific degree of candidate sciences. And the candidate of culturology on the topic transformation of the status contemporary art in Russia and China. The author conducted the comparative analysis based on China, Russian, and China. Thus, the dissertation by Dai Chuang definitely complies with all the requirements, and the author, Dai Chuang, definitely deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of culturology based on the major 24001 theory of culture. Thank you very much for your remarks. And now I'd like to give the floor to the next member of the Dissertation Council, one of the leading specialists on the history and theory of Chinese art. Thank you very much for such a compliment. I would say that this is flattering. I'm not going to talk about culturological aspects and units. This work deserves so much praise, and I would like to say that I agree with all the reviews from the point of view of relevance, from the point of view of culturology, so I would like to pay attention only to the thoughts that this research paper provokes. In my opinion, the more questions not as negative remarks, but theoretical questions that arise, it means the better the work is, since this scientific research is the main cause why those people reading it or doing it might make them think. I would like to share my ideas linked to the field not of culturology, but to the field of Chinese studies. Certain remarks. The general hypothesis is the following: the transformation of the status of the art is grounded in the transformation of the viewpoint. Thus, transformation occurs. Provision 6. Is it just to say that the issue of comparing the culture of Russia and China are done only partially? The comparative similarities are determined by culturological reflection, and both countries see their art developed based on the theories and Western influence. If we talk about comparativist approach and look at it based on the history of Russia and China in the 19th century, sometimes the thesis has a more structurally based approach to finding similarities. In my opinion, the structure is the following. First, the pre-revolutionary stage, which was based on massive disillusionment. Two revolutions, the Cultural Revolution and the Great October Revolution, which radically changed the community and which resulted in a radical change of the artwork. The period in China till 1928. War against Japan, 37-45, and the Second World War, with domineering patriotic ideas. 5. The spiritual rise and the creation of the People's Republic of China. So we can see that everything, many ideas are very synchronous. 6. The increase of disillusionment with the ideas of communism. 7. The state reformation politics. Perestroika ended up with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the reforms of Deng Xiaoping led the People's Republic of China to interpolitical and geopolitical flourishing. Thus, can we say that addressing using Western concept and spiritual values and artistic phenomenon in Soviet Russia and in China have the same archetype nature. We can see that Chinese art is greatly linked to the tradition, which creates a special symbolism. The modern Chinese art is provided in the view of American European influence. If the author agrees that the specifics of the modern Chinese art is determined by the link with tradition, so how can we identify this decisive factor? When we talk about traditional aesthetic of China based on Daos and other philosophical approaches, was linked to private art movements. And the fundamental division into official and private artistic work was conducted in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and this opposition was a key opposition throughout the history of imperial China. Can we find this opposition relevant? The state cultural policy and the official art of the modern China implicitly based on traditional aesthetics. But this issue is to be viewed separately. Otherwise, a priori, the object of the research is viewed as the processes representing only private artistic works. If we talk about the modern artistic life of the Chinese People's Republic of China, we can see several different trends. One is the consciousness of the artist. Next, the influence of the Western approach on art. And the influence of a very important objective factor has outside and inside influence. The outside artistic view shows that the internal influence and external influence might have different cultural understandings, and it's very important to view China as the cultural expansion and the cultural authenticity determination through borrowings from Western cultures. But these are my ideas to show how deep the work is. I don't want to contradict to the theoretical ideas. I don't believe that the thesis has any flaws. This is a pioneer work which raises a very controversial issue, and I would like to hope that this is the beginning of substantial and significant research project which might be implemented in future with the help of Chinese and Russian specialists. I do have some minor remarks about the translation, about the terms. This is of pure editorial nature. We have a very positive view of the thesis. I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much, Marina Evgenievna. And we give the floor to Alexei Viktorovich Smirnov. Thank you very much. Since my remarks are the final ones of the members of the council, I would like to say that I agree with the majority of views expressed. I wanted to view the same point of view that was expressed by Marina Evgenievna, that this thesis opens a great ground for future research. Two major states which have their own authentic cultures in the 20th century moved very quickly to what we call modernity or contemporary art, but their trajectories were different, which resulted in different outcomes. This is a very relevant topic, and I would like to agree with Marina Evgenievna that this might trigger a whole creation of a whole series of research This is my first remark. The second remark, I'd like to say that the thesis is very logical. We can see very clearly the aim, the task, the provisions for defense are stated very clearly. And it is clearly stated in the introduction. And the introduction is a separate, marvelous part of the thesis, which is written professionally or in a very orthodox manner, so to say, which allows us to understand the remaining parts of the thesis. Also, I'd like to say that the thesis has two types of approach. One is logical approach, and the second one is creative approach. The ideas expressed by the applicant can be found in the strict scheme that we saw in the introduction. Thus, without the introduction, it would be difficult to perceive the thesis as it was. I would like to say that I had good perception of the creative works of Chuang Dai for a long time. Since she attended my lectures, we discussed some ideas, and I could see the traces of these questions, the traces of what interested the applicant when she listened to my lectures, and I saw it in the thesis, and that was a great pleasure for me. The third aspect, certain drawbacks, and many of them have already been voiced. One is that the status of art is not defined in the thesis, the status itself, because we talk about the transformation of the status of the modern art. There is no clear time boundaries and conceptual boundaries of the modern art of Russia and China. The applicant does not give enough basis for using the dichotomy. And despite the logical structure of the work, number of paragraphs do not have internal unity, which means that the meaning of certain paragraphs does not allow us to come to the conclusions provided at the end of each of the paragraph. On the whole, I would like to say that the thesis corresponds to the requirements of the wording of scientific degrees. The thesis corresponds to the major 24001, and the applicant, Chuang Dai, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of Culturology on major theory and history of culture. Thank you very much. I would also like to pay attention to some of my comments. If we talk about the relevance, Chuang Dai forms culturological methodology with the help of which it is possible to consider modern and contemporary art. The idea of the concept of modernity and contemporary art is dominant in the practice of analyzing culture in China and in Russia and throughout the world. Remarks. The first remark. In the third chapter, Chuang describes the philosophical views of Wen Gui and Zun Beihua. In accordance to the analysis, we can see that those thinkers were influenced by German classical philosophy and the ideas of Immanuel Kant. And the logic is the following. we can see how German or European philosophy influenced the philosophical, aesthetical ideas of China. Maybe for each scientist specializing in studies of China, I don't see it clearly how these two people represent the entire spectrum of the thought of China. Is that the mainstream of philosophy or marginal view of philosophy? And one of my remarks does not require an answer. When conducting comparative analysis of Russian and Chinese culture, Chuang creates a triangle. One aspect is the relevant culturological reflection of Europe. In my opinion, this aspect is not at the same distance from other two aspects, since this view was of Europe was formed in the context of the Russian culture, not in the context of the culture of China. Thus, such disposition for comparative analysis will always favor Russian culture. But this is my personal remark. I suppose that those studying European and Asian arts wouldn't agree with me, so you don't have to provide an answer to that remark. The comments and the remarks that I have voiced do not underestimate the conclusions driven by the applicant, and agreeing with Alexei Viktorovich, talking about the structure of the thesis, I would like to state the following. The thesis by Dai Chuang, The Transformation of the Status of Contemporary Art in Russia and China, complies to the main requirements of the order of awarding the scientific degrees, and Dai Chuang deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of Culturology on the major 2400 Theory and History of Culture. We finish with the reviews, and I would like to give the floor to Chuang and to provide answers. I'll be reading what I have already written down, but if I miss something, please ask me once again. Dear Marina Evgenievna, Anna Yurievna, Marina Valerievna, Zlatica, Evgeny Anatolyevich, Alexei Viktorovich, Anatoly Mikhailovich, and Gennady Evgenievich.
Прежде всего, я хочу поблагодарить вас за внимательное.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your attentive and friendly attitude to my thesis. What was expressed in your feedback and your reviews allowed me to draw attention to many aspects of the problems I was researching that remained outside the scope of my attention. Undoubtedly, the recommendation, remarks, and instructions that are found in your words will stimulate me for further reflection. I will certainly take into account what you said in my subsequent scientific works. I agree with many comments. I can only regret that I was inattentive. As for other comments, I would like to clarify my position and explain what I was guided by when formulating certain provisions. Dear Alexei Viktorovich, you point out that the understanding of the status of the art is not well defined. Indeed, I did not deliberately dwell on the definition of the status of art as such. For in different historical eras and different cultures, the status changed, and this depended on the specific situation and place. It was be possible to make a separate thesis on the topic, but not in cultural studies, but in the philosophy of culture and aesthetics. But the fact is that I was not interested in status in general, but in contemporary art in Russia and China. I can say the same about the fact that there is no description of the manifestation of the dynamics of Russian art. Next, there is no clear definition of the time and conceptual boundaries of contemporary art in Russia and China. Let me explain. When we talk about contemporary art in Russia and China in the dissertation, we don't mean formal chronology that could be determined by dates. This is not formal reference to the years, but the concept of modernity. From this point of view, not all artistic artifacts of the 21st centuries can be assessed as contemporary art. Contemporary art is primarily the result of mastering the concept of modernity, which I dwelt upon in sufficient detail in paragraph 1 of chapter 1. I'm sad that I could not articulate this clearly. Dear Anna Yudivna, your remark that the text lacks attention to the differences associated with cultural changes from modernism to postmodernism and to metamodernism is absolutely correct. But in the thesis, I focused on other issues, paying more attention to the concept of modernity as the basis for interpretation and inference, as well as one of the sources of Russian and Chinese contemporary art. Comparing modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism, tracing the ongoing cultural changes, this is the topic for a separate, special, and I would like to say very difficult discussion. That's why I did not dwell on the purpose. Evgeny Anatolyevich, in response to your remarks that the tasks of examining the phenomenon of contemporary art in Russia and China in the context of the influence of European reflection is unsuccessfully formulated, and Europe is not an equidistant point from both Russian and Chinese cultures from comparative analysis, I can say the following. Indeed, both formally and in reality, Europe is closer to Russia than to China. But Europe, of course, in different ways, influenced both countries. European concept of art, artistic experience of European cultures can be considered to a large extent the initial and defining horizon of transformations for the ideas and practices of contemporary art both in Russia and China. Therefore, I consider it possible to take in the European tradition as a common and symbolic point of reference for comparative analysis. Furthermore, European ideological and cultural investment in Russia began earlier than they began in China. Therefore, diachrony for Russian art in the first half of the 20th century, in China art the 18th century. That is your remark. And the similar question are contained in the responses of Anatoly Mikhailovich and Alexei Viktorovich. That is why I studied the art of China and art of Russia in different historical periods. Within the time limit that I determined, we can observe similar, although differently occurring basic conceptual, which had a wide resonance in the culture transformations. It still seems to me that for Chinese contemporary art and Russian contemporary art and the influence of European art is alien. You can force something completely and totally alien. If something is borrowed, this is somehow the request of the culture. European concepts and European models have already become part of contemporary Chinese art and contemporary Chinese society. How they transform and how they acquire their appearance in the Chinese cultural tradition is another issue. Of course, the fact of cultural, political, and historical diversity of European region is beyond doubt. However, in the dissertation, I studied from the concept of Europe, as understood by Trubetskoy in his work Europe and Humanity, and Danilevsky in his work Europe and Russia. That is, as an idea and a concept at the same time. Why one Gavay and Zunbahua? They are the leading theory thinkers of their time, generally accepted in China and abroad. Their theory have had a significant impact on the development of Chinese art, aesthetics, and philosophy, and their works are still relevant today. This is why I paid so much attention to these particular thinkers. Dear Marina Evgenievna, I am sorry that I made the mistakes that you pointed out. The requirement of scientific discipline and professional responsibility is what I need to focus on, and in the future will be very attentive to my scientific speech. You ask, how justified is it to take it granted that the appeal to Western concepts, spiritual values, and artistic phenomena in Russia and in China have the same archetypal nature? Of course, if we talk about the archetypal nature of these different countries is different, and I'm aware of that. However, it seems to me that after all there is a functional, instrumental, and formal analogies that influence Russian and Chinese art on behalf of Europe. And the thesis, it is not a given, but this is a certain tool that allowed to demonstrate how different archetypal nature of cultural traditions has led to the distinction of art forms, views, practices, tools, and technologies. That is why I chose the most representative practices in terms of the presentation of archetypal tradition and the way it was implemented in the artistic practice. For Russia, that was architecture and town planning, and for China, that was ink painting and performance. Alexei Viktorovich also paid attention to this aspect. Dear Zlatitsa, I agree with the idea that Chinese postmodernism is only schematically characterized. I limited myself only to general indications that in Chinese postmodernism as well as Chinese postmodernism, there is no tradition of metaphysics as such, without which we cannot imagine either modernity or postmodernism. This tradition, which can only be continually called the tradition of Chinese metaphysics, exists in many layers, as fragments that lose their context and as archetype that persists in the midst of artists. Then the choice of landscape gardening art, as an example, is due to the fact that, on the one hand, we are dealing with a genre characteristic of art, as art, significant for both China and Russia. On the other hand, here the nature of the worldview, the archetypes of the consciousness of culture, tradition of understanding the world and the beauty of the world, experience of a person present in the world are clearly manifested directly, and the symbolism is realized through direct presence in the world. Dear Anatoly Mikhailovich, indeed, in the part the degree of scientific elaboration, we have only Oriental studies that have become classical. And this choice is conscious. I believe that classical oriented studies that I have mentioned have not lost their relevance, they're fundamental. And what has been written over the past 20 years on this topic cannot compete with them in terms of level and scientific significance. However, when studying the influence of the Chinese tradition in contemporary art, we'll look into the monographs and articles. Is it possible to consider Chinese realistic painting as an influence of a global Soviet project? Anatoly Mikhailovich, I believe you can. Of course you can. And even necessary. But this is a separate discussion. Perhaps in the future I will do this on purpose. Dear Marina Valerievna, you rightly point out that the sources in the bibliographic list of references in Dissertation are not always relevant. As an explanation, I can say that my research was guided by an interdisciplinary principle. And since the material is immense and heterogeneous, it was not always possible to correctly correlate the significance of one or another source with the general methodological and theoretical preconditions of the thesis. I will try to be more careful in the choice of sources in the future. Dear Gennady Evgenyevich, the analysis of Soviet art of the 60s and 70s and 90s is necessary. When I started working on my thesis, I was attending to do that. However, diving into the work, starting to work directly on the text of the thesis, I realized that the inclusion of these issues, as well as the issues of philosophy of modernism and post-Soviet period, the art of new media is indicated by Anna, as well as comparison of arts of Russia and China 21st century, would increase the volume of work to unacceptable volumes. Therefore, I had to abandon this idea and limit myself when considering these issues. Probably my choice was not convincingly argued and logically substantiation in the texts of the thesis. This is my fault, I admit. In my future scientific activity, I'll certainly return to these topics and reflect on them. Once again, Marina Evgenyevna, Anna Yurievna, Marina Evgenyevna, Zlasica, Evgenia Anatolievna, Alexey Viktorovich, Anatoly Mikhailovich, and Gennady Evgenyevich, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chuan, for your answers. Dear members of the Decision Council, are there any more questions? Are we fully satisfied with the answers? We're fully satisfied. Thank you very much. We move to the next stage of our procedure. The colleagues who are present today, who are not members of the council, might have the floor if willing. There's nobody willing. Then we move to the next point. Are there any questions that received their email? I would like to remind you colleagues that it was possible to view the broadcast and to formulate questions, but we received no questions. So we move on forward. We give the floor to the scientific advisor. Scientific advisor Evgeny Georgievich Sokolov, professor, the head of the Department of Russian Philosophy and Culture. So I have 5 minutes. I'll try to be brief. I remember Evgeny Anatolyevich, I don't have to say anything about the thesis itself, the work itself. I would like to say that Dai Chuang is a great postgraduate student in all respects, very studious, and when it seems that the material and the data is so diverse and boundless, she's still eager to meet the challenge. The work is dedicated to culturological issues, but a lot of time was dedicated to such issues. What is art? What is contemporary art? What is ornament? What is ornamentarism? And these issues, of course, they were outside the thesis. They remained outside the text. But this idea of analyzing the fundamental issues, to me, as a representative of a philosophical faculty, is of crucial importance. Maybe it is not always reflected in the work, but that was a very important issue for the applicant herself, and I praise it. We can move on to the next point. That is the discussion. To the members of the Decision Council want to express their opinions and to voice their ideas, I would like to say a few words. Well, in addition to my presentation, having heard the answers by Dai Chuang, I was reinforced in my hopes. This is a great researcher who understands the problems identified by external viewers. And Dai Chuang limited the dissertation consciously, and the applicant is still working on this sphere. I have only one short question to ask. One of the objects of the dissertations was the analysis of the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympic Games. Not so long ago, we had the opening ceremony of the Tokyo Olympic Games. Did Dai Chuang watch it from the point of view of her methodology? Maybe that is the scope of her future work. But on the whole, I would like to reiterate that the thesis can be appraised. Dai Chuang, would you like to answer this question? Yes, if we talk about the opening ceremony of Beijing Olympic Games, was a very important part, a very interesting part of the thesis. We know that emperor is very important for China, and this international event was very important for China and much awaited. When we know that we have the opportunity to organize Olympic Games, the state and the government organized everything. The best, the most modern, the most contemporary works of art for this ceremony. A well-known film director participated. The leading composers participated in opening ceremony. This is a very important example to demonstrate the level of contemporary art. Chai Mo has a series of interview how he conducted the ceremony. He is a great film director, and he has a lot of friends in China and abroad who are contemporary artists. Some of them created design of buildings for Olympic Games, and that was a very special form of architecture of the time. That's why I paid attention to the ceremony, how it represents China. He wanted to show Chinese tradition, to show the most ancient instruments. Nobody knows how to use the instruments, how they look, but Chai Mo decided to show his perception of how it looked. And when preparing for the ceremony, the soldiers who were participating in playing this instrument, they were showing how they were playing this kind of drum, although it is not a drum. And the director decided to use a different approach to presenting this instrument, not to do it in a conventional way, not to beat the drum directly, but laterally. And Chinese drum was a fragment of Chinese culture. Thank you very much for an interesting question. Are there any more questions and remarks? I would like to speak briefly. I haven't seen Dai Chuang previously, and I want to say that we can find in the written text, we can see this attention to details with scientific passion, with the interest of the applicant to the research, and the desire to share what was found. And I could witness it now in person. I think that this thesis has certain issues for discussions, but these issues mean a new story, a new thesis, and a new scientific discussion. So I'd like to say that I support this work, and I vote for awarding of the scientific degree, and I would like to wish the author further interesting projects, maybe not only in culturology, but to work with art and certain artistic projects. And thank you so much for such responses to your questions. Marina Evgenievna, the floor is yours. A couple of words. I would like to say that this work is the beginning of the project. I'd like to say the following. The first remark about the globalization of the process of the 20th century. What starts the revolution of the European art? The European art of the 19th century, one of important factors is getting to know Oriental art, Japanese art. And the Japanese art, what is Japanese art? This is based on Chinese art. That is China, then Japan, then Europe, then to Russia, then it comes back to China. And I think that we should always take that into consideration when we address certain issue. If we address a certain European school, if we get into the details, well, the external factors are linked to Europe, but the internal ones might be linked to Oriental studies. What is this replica? And as for borrowings, not so long ago, I encountered a marvelous idea. What is necessary for China, what is not necessary for China. That dealt with European experience. And the author of the idea says, China is like a snake. Which swallows everything, digests what is necessary, and vomits which is not necessary. I wouldn't say that this is characteristic of China, that is more characteristic of Japan. This image was used by Mao in one of his articles of 1939. And following this image, when we talk about the borrowings, question arises. Western countries think that they control the snake. But the snake pretends that it is controlled by the Western flute. But the snake thinks, at the same time, should they consume the player of the flute? And if yes, when should it be done? So the model is absolutely different. Well, I didn't understand the second question. It was not a question. I will explain to you later. These are very comprehensive issues, and it's very important that you raise these issues in a way. And in my perception, we should take into consideration the difference of mentality, the difference of position, and the difference of perception. And what you start doing should be continued. And I'd like to wish you success. Thank you very much. Chuan, you don't have to answer these remarks. That was just for your information, so to say. There are no more questions, so we move on. Before we move on to the second point of the procedure, I need to ask the following question. Do the members of the Dissertation Council and Chuan have any questions or comments on the procedure of the minutes? No remarks? Then we move on to the next point. That is voting. We need to decide the following issue. Do we need a technical break to discuss the results of the defense, or we can move on to the voting procedure directly? Yes, we move on into voting procedure directly. Then, colleagues, we start the open roll call. You need to say if you agree or disagree to award the scientific degree of candidate of Culturology, Major 240001. And the decision of the Dissertation Council on awarding the candidate degree is considered positive if more than half of the members of the Dissertation Council voted for it, but no less than 3 participants. In accordance with the minutes, I will call on to the members of the Dissertation Council, and you will have to voice your opinion. Alexeyev, Praxin, and Anatoly Mikhailovich, your opinion. I believe that the thesis transformation of the status of contemporary art in Russia and China fully complies with all the strict criteria and without any doubt we can state that Dai Chuang deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of Culturology. Council member Zlasitsa Plashenkova. I vote for. Thank you. Council member Alive Gennady Evgenievich, your opinion, please. The thesis corresponds to the requirements, and I vote for awarding Dai Chuang the scientific degree of candidate of Culturology. Bidukova Marina Valerievna, member of council. Dear colleagues, I believe that the thesis by Dai Chuang corresponds to all the requirements and the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree. Demshina Amna Yurivna, the thesis corresponds to the requirements. The thesis contains innovative conclusions belonging to the author, and I vote for. Kravtsova Marina Evgenievna, I vote for. Smirnov Alexander Viktorovich, I vote for. Thank you very much. And I, Chairman of the Council, Makovetsky Evgeny Anatolovich, vote for. Well, it's not difficult for me to count the votes. Dear colleagues and guests, I'd like to declare that out of the participating 8 dissertation members of the Dissertation Council, 8 people voted for. No one against, no one abstained. The decision to award Dai Chuang the degree of Candidate of Cultural Studies in the Scientific Major 2401 Theory History of Culture accepted. Chuang would like to congratulate you, and you have the opportunity to have the final word. In my final word, first of all, I'd like to thank the much esteemed members of the Dissertation Council, Marina Evgenievna, Anna Yurievna, Marina Yevgenievna, Zlatisa, Evgeny Anatolievich, Alexey Viktorovich, Anatoly Mikhailovich, and Gennady Evgenievich for wise and friendly attitude to me and my work, for support and attention to my ideas. The remarks, questions, instructions, comments voiced in your reviews and questions were very useful for me, for the person who's making the first steps in science. Your words is a great source of my future flourishing. I will take everything into consideration and use in my future scientific work. I think that this defense was a first step on my scientific work. I'd like to thank St. Petersburg State University for the opportunity to be a postgraduate student, for unwavering support that I received. These were unforgettable great years, which I will always remember. At the Institute of Philosophy, St. Petersburg State University, in St. Petersburg, Russia, I never felt myself a foreigner. I'd like to thank my scientific supervisor. I'd like to thank beloved Alexander Evgenievich for his advice and recommendations, which I was trying to follow in my thesis. Alexander Evgenievich, your ideas, your attitude to profession, your teaching will always remain for me unattainable role models. Dear Alexey Anatolievich, your help is crucial for me. Chuang, thank you very much. We would like to congratulate you. Dear colleagues, we declare the meeting closed. I'd like to thank you all for participation. Please turn off live broadcast of the meeting. Thank you.